Case 1. The basement serial killer, Richard Fox. If you walk the Rails to Trails path in Portland, New York, you are walking through silence. What was once a railway line has been reclaimed by nature. Miles of dense woods, long stretches of gravel, and that steady hush hikers go looking for when they want peace more than conversation. It's the kind of place where the world feels far away. But in September 2021, that peace was broken. A woman hiking near Walben Road noticed something on the ground that didn't belong to the forest. At first, it looked like debris, something pale, something weathered. Then the shape registered. It wasn't just a bone. It was a human skull. Police arrived shortly afterward, secured the scene, and approached it the way investigators often do, as a single grim discovery, possibly an old tragic cold case finally surfacing. That assumption didn't survive long. As forensic teams expanded the search area, they noticed disturbed soil nearby, fresh enough to stand out against the natural layering of leaves and earth. Only yards away, they dug again. And what they found turned one discovery into a nightmare. A second woman buried in a shallow grave. The first victim was Cassandra Watson, missing since 2004. The second was Marquita Mull, who hadn't been missing for decades, but for months. Two women, nearly 20 years apart, buried in essentially the same place, roughly 50 miles from their homes in Buffalo. That detail changes everything. This wasn't a random dumping ground. This was familiar territory to someone, a chosen place, effectively a private graveyard for a single predator. His name is Richard J. Fox. In November 2025, Fox was sentenced to 40 years to life for the murders of Cassandra Watson and Marquita Mull. On paper, a conviction like that reads like closure, a life sentence, a headline, a final chapter. But this story refuses to end cleanly, because the most terrifying part isn't only what happened in the woods. It's where Richard Fox was living while all of this was happening. Fox wasn't hiding in a cabin or drifting from town to town. He was living in Niagara Falls, blending into routines, working as a handyman, someone who didn't need to break in because he was invited in, someone trusted with doors, keys, basements, stairwells, storage rooms, the spaces people don't watch closely because they assume they're safe. But months before his sentencing in May 2025, the investigation had already taken a darker turn. Police searched a home on Orleans Avenue in Niagara Falls, one of the properties connected to Fox. As they broke through drywall beneath the staircase, they found human remains hidden inside the structure of the house. The victim was Crystal Kurthoys. And in that moment, the case stopped being only about a trail in the woods. Because Fox didn't just hide the dead in remote places, he hid them in homes, in walls, under stairs, in places built to shelter life. That's why the term basement serial killer lands so hard. Basements aren't just physical spaces, they're psychological ones. They're where families store what they don't want to deal with, where clutter piles up, where silence settles. They're the last place most people think to search, and the first place a predator with access might choose. Richard Fox is behind bars, but the question keeping authorities and families awake at night is simple, and it's haunting. He worked as a handyman for years. He had access for years. So investigators continue to look backward, tracing jobs, properties, and old missing person reports, not to provoke panic, but because this is what responsible policing looks like when the threat wasn't a stranger in the dark, and it was someone with keys. And the case leaves the community with a warning that doesn't fade when the sentence is handed down. Sometimes the danger isn't outside your home. Sometimes it already had a reason to be inside. So the question remains, sharp, unfinished, and heavy. Where else did he work, and what else might still be hidden under the stairs? Case 2, the Niagara cluster, Zawacki and Curtis. Richard Fox was a monster we could see. He had a face, he had a name, he had a method. But 20 minutes away, beneath the roar of one of the world's most famous landmarks, a different kind of darkness is operating. One that has no face, one that is environmental, unforgiving, and final. We tend to think of Niagara Falls as a place of constant visibility. It is a stage. Millions of tourists, endless smartphones, security cameras, and the relentless gaze of the public. Statistically, it should be impossible to vanish here without a trace. And yet, since 2020, a disturbing pattern has played out in the asphalt parking lots near Prospect Point. It isn't about who is taking these men. It's about why the landscape refuses to give them back. The mystery begins on February 5th, 2020. Jerry Zawacki was 69 years old. He wasn't a tourist passing through. He was a fixture of the city. He drove a taxi. He knew the streets, the shortcuts, and the rhythms of the area better than anyone. On that Wednesday, his taxi was found abandoned in the main parking lot of Niagara Falls State Park, specifically the 300 block of Prospect Point. Inside the cab, nothing seemed amiss. The vehicle wasn't broken down. It was simply parked. But Jerry was gone. Investigators immediately pulled the surveillance tapes, hoping for a simple answer. Instead, they saw something more unsettling. The footage captured Jerry walking alone. He was seen pausing near the brink of the falls, looking over the railing. Then cameras tracked him, crossing the pedestrian bridge onto Goat Island. And that is where the timeline ends. The camera saw him go to the island. They never saw him come back. Did he enter the water? Did he find a blind spot in the surveillance grid and walk away? Authorities monitored the gorge for months. Recovery units watched the currents. Usually the river eventually returns the fallen, but in Jerry's case, the water gave back nothing. No body, no clothing, and no answers. For a year, it remained a singular, baffling tragedy. Then the clock reset January 12th, 2021. Brock Curtis, 24 years old, drove to the area. A graduate of Niagara University and a former athlete who had studied in South Korea, Brock was fighting battles, invisible to the outside world. He was looking for work. He was receiving therapy. He drove 90 minutes from his home and pulled into a parking lot in the same general area, Prospect Point. And just like Jerry, Brock left his vehicle behind. But unlike Jerry, reports suggest Brock's final movements were more definitive. He was seen entering the water near the brink, and it seemed straightforward, a tragic loss of a young life. But then, the same haunting silence followed, despite standard recovery protocols and despite his family's desperate need for closure. The river yielded nothing. His mother later walked the Camino de Santiago in Spain and cycled 3,000 miles across the United States, carrying his memory, waiting for news that never came. This is the Niagara paradox. Two men, 1 year apart, both leaving their vehicles in the shadows of the same landmark. One vanished onto an island. The other vanished into the mist. Statistically, bodies are recovered. The river is powerful, but it usually surrenders its secrets eventually. But for Jerry Zawacki and Brock Curtis, the falls became a true abyss. As of January 2026, both men remain missing. Their cars were found, their stories were known, but they themselves have become part of the landscape, a reminder that in this massive, roaring place, sometimes there is no return. Case 3, the politician vanishing Petros Chromidas. We tell ourselves that people vanish because they are isolated. We imagine them hiking alone in deep woods or driving empty roads at night. We assume disappearance is a consequence of invisibility. But what happens when the person who vanishes is seen by everyone? In April of 2025, New York lost a man who was everywhere. His name was Petros Chromidas. He was 29 years old, an Ivy League graduate, a rising political figure running for the Nassau County Legislature. He wasn't living in the shadows, he was living on campaign posters, on billboards, and in the public eye. And then, on April 23rd, 2025, something that should not have been possible happened. He disappeared. That evening, Petros parked his car near the Allegria Hotel in Long Beach. It was a Wednesday night. The beach was quiet. There were no crowds, no chaos. Later, police found his belongings on the sand, his towel, his clothes, his phone. They were not scattered. They were not damaged. The clothes were neatly folded, arranged with a level of care that felt deliberate. An official theory formed almost immediately. Investigators suggested he may have gone for a night swim, encountered dangerous conditions, and drowned. A tragic accident. On the surface, it sounded plausible until you look closer at the man himself. Petros Chromidas was not a casual swimmer taking a reckless risk. He was a collegiate rower, a triathlete, a man who trained in cold water as part of his sport. The ocean was not foreign to him. It was familiar. Search efforts were extensive. Helicopters scanned the coastline. Drones flew overhead. Dive teams searched the waters again and again. In cases like this, the ocean usually yields something. This time, it gave back nothing. No remains, no shoes, no trace. As of January 2026, Petros Chromidas has never been found. There has been no recovery, no confirmation of death, and no legal declaration that he is deceased. And that absence created a legal situation New York had never confronted before. Because Petros was never found, the legal system was required to treat him as if he were still alive. Efforts to remove his name from the ballot were challenged, and the courts ruled that, under state law, a person cannot be presumed dead without a prolonged period of unexplained absence. Legally, Petros Chromidas was not dead. He was simply absent. The election went forward. Voters were asked to make a choice that should not have existed at all, casting ballots for a man who existed on paper, but nowhere else. This is what makes the case so unsettling. Petros Chromidas did not disappear because he was forgotten. He disappeared despite being known, despite being watched, despite having the attention of an entire county. It forces questions that have no clean answers. Did a highly trained athlete drown without leaving a single trace? Did a young political figure walk away from his life entirely? Or was the quiet scene on the beach, those neatly folded clothes, not the aftermath of a tragedy, but something more deliberate? Without a body, there is no certainty. Without certainty, there is no closure, there's only absence. And a name that remains, printed, recorded, and unresolved, long after the man himself vanished. Case 4, the Smoothie Cup breakthrough. Teresa Fusco. We've talked about the vanished, the missing, the cases where the trail ends in silence, but I want to end this collection with a reminder, one that matters deeply as we enter 2026. Silence is no longer a guarantee of safety for the guilty. Sometimes justice doesn't fail, sometimes it just takes the long way home. To understand the end of this story, we have to go back to the beginning. November 10th, 1984. Lynbrook, New York, Teresa Fusco was 16 years old. That evening, her shift at the roller rink ended in heartbreak. She had been let go from her job. Distressed and upset, she stepped out into the cool autumn air to walk home alone. She never made it. Weeks later, her body was discovered in a wooded area near the railroad tracks. The crime was brutal, violent, and it demanded an answer. In the rush to provide one, the system failed. 3 young men, John Kogut, John Restivo, and Dennis Halstead, were arrested. They became known as the Lynbrook Three. From the beginning, they maintained their innocence, but public pressure was intense. They were convicted. For nearly 18 years, they lived behind bars for a crime they did not commit. In 2003, DNA testing finally told the truth. The biological evidence recovered from Teresa Fusco did not belong to any of them. They were exonerated and released, but their freedom came with a chilling realization. If they didn't do it, then the real killer had walked free for decades. For more than 40 years, the case sat in Nassau County's cold case files. The suspect remained unknown. Whoever committed the crime likely believed time had erased the danger. He was wrong. In 2024, investigators returned to the evidence with new science, forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for a direct match, they built family trees, tracing DNA through distant relatives, narrowing the branches generation by generation until the search pointed to a single name. Richard Ballot, 63 years old, living quietly in Center Mauritius, a man who had been 23 years old and living just a mile from the rink when Teresa vanished. But investigators couldn't act on probability alone. They needed a direct DNA match. In February 2024, surveillance teams quietly monitored Ballot's movements. They weren't looking for a weapon. They weren't looking for a confession. They were looking for trash. They watched him buy a smoothie at a local cafe. They watched him drink it, and when he was finished, they watched him discard the empty cup into a public trash can. That single ordinary act ended more than 4 decades of freedom. Detectives retrieved the cup. The straw was swabbed. The results were definitive. The DNA recovered from the straw was a 1-to-1 match with the biological evidence preserved from 1984. On October 15, 2025, Richard Ballot was arraigned in Mineola. According to prosecutors, when confronted with the science that identified him, Ballot did not panic or protest. He reportedly remarked that people got away with murder back then. The assistant district attorney responded plainly, "It's 2025 and your day of reckoning is now. Richard Ballot is now behind bars, but his arrest has reopened painful questions. Teresa Fusco was not the only girl to vanish from that area. In the mid-1980s, Kelly Morrissey disappeared in 1984 and was never found. Jacqueline Martorella was found dead on a golf course in 1985. For decades, these cases were treated as separate mysteries. Today, authorities are examining them again. No charges have been filed in those cases. This story carries a warning for anyone who believes time is protection. You leave a trace every time you live your life, every breath, every cup, every careless moment. Justice may move slowly, but it does not forget. And sometimes all it takes is a smoothie cup. We started this journey in the deep woods of Portland, believing that is where secrets are kept. We ended it in a suburban trash can, realizing that secrets can be discarded in broad daylight. If there is a lesson to be taken from the cases that unfolded in 2025, viewed now from the opening days of 2026, it is this. Our old assumptions about safety and about danger no longer hold. The case of Richard Fox taught us that the predator is not always hiding in the shadows. Sometimes he is the man fixing your sink, the man with the keys, the man who understands which spaces are rarely checked and which doors are quietly trusted. The Niagara cluster reminded us that crowds do not equal safety. These so-called zones of transience are designed for movement, not for memory. And in places built for constant motion, it becomes disturbingly easy for someone to slip through unnoticed. The disappearance of Petros Chromatus shattered the myth of visibility. Status, recognition, and strength are not shields. You can have the attention of an entire county and still vanish without a trace. But the final story, the story of the Smoothie Cup, offers balance. It reminds us that while the methods of predators have changed very little, the memory of the world has. You can destroy evidence, you can bury weapons, but you cannot erase your own biology. Before we close the file, there is one more cost we need to acknowledge. 3 men lost nearly 18 years of their lives. You might be asking, if Richard Ballot was responsible, how did John Kogut, John Restivo, and Dennis Halstead end up convicted? The answer is a lesson in what happens when the justice system prioritizes resolution over certainty. At the time, Investigators did not have DNA. They did not have a weapon. What they had was a narrative and the pressure to make it stick. John Cogut was subjected to an interrogation that lasted many hours. During questioning, he was told he had failed a polygraph test, a claim later shown to be inaccurate. Exhausted and overwhelmed, he signed a confession prepared by investigators, one that implicated others. At trial, prosecutors relied on forensic methods that were widely accepted at the time, but are now known to be unreliable. An expert testified that hair evidence found in a vehicle was a microscopic match to the victim. It sounded scientific. It sounded conclusive. Today, we understand how subjective and error-prone that technique can be. The jury believed the testimony. They believed the confession. And 3 innocent men were sent to prison while the real perpetrator remained free for decades. So here's the deeper lesson. The Smoothie Cup didn't just identify a killer, it exposed the difference between storytelling and science. Confessions can be coerced, witnesses can be mistaken, experts can be wrong. Biology does not negotiate. Now, I want to turn this question over to you. And the conviction of the Lynbrook 3 was based on what was considered legitimate science in the 1980s. Today, we trust DNA, but it raises an uncomfortable thought. What techniques are we relying on now that future generations may one day look back on and question? Are we safer today? Or are there still people blending in because we are focused on the wrong kind of evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I want to know whether this case restores your faith in justice or makes you more cautious about it. If you believe these stories deserve attention, consider liking this video and subscribing. We're going to keep digging until every box in the evidence room is opened. This is Unforeseen Fates. Stay observant, question what sounds certain, and I'll see you in the next investigation.